and welcome to Crimes Through Time, a weekly snapshot of crime history. Florence and James Maybrick had a troubled marriage. Both parties were serially unfaithful and neither wanted the union to continue. Then James got ill. Not unusual, he was a lifelong hypochondriac, but this time he would pass away. James's cause of death was arsenic poisoning. His family raised their suspicions about the circumstances of his death, and Florence was charged and convicted with his murder. She maintained her innocence and won a reprieve from the noose, and even a case review 15 years later. I will discuss both sides, and let you decide if a murder occurred, and if so, was Florence the culprit. The significance of this case would amplify over 100 years after it occurred, when a diary and a pocket watch were discovered, which raised the question, was James Maybrick actually Jack the Ripper? And was the reason the killing spree stopped and Jack disappeared because he was murdered by his wife? Let's dive in. James Maybrick was born on the 25th of October 1838 in Liverpool, which was in Lancashire at the time. He was the third of 7 sons born to Susanna and William, and was named after a brother who had passed away a year before his birth. He would carve out a successful career in Liverpool as a cotton merchant. For his business, he would travel regularly to the United States, and in 1871 he set up a branch office in Norfolk, Virginia. In 1874, James contracted malaria. The medication he took to treat the disease contained arsenic. He would become addicted to this drug for the rest of his life. He would return to Britain in 1880. He sailed from New York City on the 12th of March and would arrive in Liverpool 6 days later. It was on this voyage he would be introduced to Florence, Elizabeth Chandler. Florrie was the daughter of William George Chandler and his wife Caroline. She was born on the 3rd of September 1862 in Mobile, Alabama. William was a one-time mayor and a partner in the banking firm St. John, Powers and Company. They lived in Chandler Mansion in Mobile. Unfortunately, he would pass away before Florrie was born. Her mother would go on to remarry, and then marry again for the 3rd time in 1872 to Baron Adolf von Roeg, a cavalry officer in the German army. The family were travelling to Liverpool when Florrie met James. They caused many raised eyebrows among the other passengers, spending so much time together unchaperoned. At this time, Florrie was 18 years old and James 42. But it was love at first sight and they began to plan the wedding immediately. The couple would wed on the 27th of July 1881 in St James Church, Piccadilly, London. They then returned to Liverpool, settling in James's home at Battlecrease House in Egbert, a suburb south of the city. They employed a cook and 2 maids. They would have 2 children together, a son, James Chandler, Bobo, born in 1882, and a daughter, Gladys Evelyn, born in 1886. A nanny was employed to look after the children. The Maybricks enjoyed the social scene of Liverpool, attending all the most fashionable and important balls and functions. They played the part of a happy and successful couple very well, but behind the scenes the marriage was disintegrating. His cotton business meant James continued to split his time between America and Britain, which put a strain on the couple. He also had become a hypochondriac, regularly using arsenic and patent medicines, what we would now call over-the-counter or non-prescription medicines, which claimed to prevent and cure all manner of ailments, but actually contained poisonous chemicals. James also had several mistresses, one of which was Sarah Ann Robertson, who would have 5 children with him. It is possible that Sarah and James were portraying themselves as married to those around them, because in her stepfather's will, she is referred to as Sarah Ann Maybrick, wife of James. Florence was also stepping out on her marriage, starting a relationship with Alfred Brearley, a local businessman and one of James's friends. In Victorian society, the right of a man to commit adultery was written in law, but a man could divorce an unfaithful wife. When James found out, he flew into a rage. He assaulted Florrie and informed her he intended to divorce her. Now, there is a suggestion that Florrie entered into her extramarital affair after finding out about James's long-standing infidelity, knowing he would find out and she could get the divorce she desired. But talks of divorce will be put aside when on Saturday the 27th of April 1889, when James was taken ill. The next day the doctor was called to him. Dr. Humphrey, the children's doctor, arrived, rather than the family doctor, Dr. Hopper. Florrie had recently attended Dr. Hopper's office with James. She had expressed her concerns about James's intake of poisons. He regularly took arsenic in a cup of beef tea, and then carried a tonic also containing arsenic, which he dosed himself with. He also used a preparation containing strychnine, telling the doctor James often felt worse after this medication. Dr. Hopper strongly warned James against this practice and the consequences of continuing, but he failed to deter him. After visits on the following Monday and Tuesday, Dr. Humphrey diagnosed chronic dyspepsia and prescribed a strict diet. He felt better and went to work on Wednesday, but by Friday he was ill again, complaining of pain in his legs. Saturday and Sunday, James was vomiting and his hands felt numb. It was at this point Edwin, James's brother, who was staying at Battle Crease after a visit to America, decided to get a second opinion, and Dr. Carter came to examine James. He agreed with Dr. Humphreys and recommended a strict diet. At no point did anyone tell the doctors of James's addiction to arsenic. On Wednesday, two of James's friends, Mrs. Biggs and Mrs. Hughes, arrived. They reported to Edwin and also telegrammed Michael, another brother in London, to share their concerns about Florrie. On the 23rd of April, she had purchased fly paper and was soaking them in water in a washstand. She explained it was to prepare a beauty treatment to clear up some skin complaints she had. This was not unusual if it hadn't been for the circumstances. The fly papers were soaked to extract arsenic, and this aroused the lady's suspicions. A trained nurse was sent for to look after James. Around 3 p.m, Florrie gave their nanny, Alice Yap, a letter to take to Alfred Bruley. As sealed letters often do, it came open and the letter fell out, and Alice read it. Dearest, since my return I have been nursing M, day and night. He is sick unto death. Alice gave the letter to Edwin. Florrie was prevented from tending to her husband further and almost put on house arrest by the family. On Thursday, the 9th of May, James took a turn for the worse. Samples of urine and faeces were taken to test for arsenic, but none were found. A nurse reported that Florrie had tampered with a Valentine's meat juice bottle. It would later be found to contain arsenic. Florrie stated that James had requested a pick-me-up, but never drank the contents. By Saturday, the 11th of May, 1889, James's condition deteriorated. His children were taken to him at 5 p.m, and he passed away just after 8 p.m. Florrie would write about this moment as she knelt by his bedside in her memoirs. Quote, Death had wiped out the memory of many things. I was thankful to remember that I had stopped divorce proceedings and that we had become reconciled for the children's sake. The post-mortem was carried out on the 13th of May and it was concluded he died due to an irritant poison. But James's brothers remained suspicious, and the body was exhumed on the 30th of May for toxic analysis of the organs. 20 milligrams of arsenic was found in his liver. An inquest was convened at a local hotel. From this, Florrie was charged with murder. She was detained in Walton Jail Hospital. Her trial began at Liverpool Summer Assizes on the 31st of July 1889, before Mr. Justice Stephen. All the medical testimony agreed he died from gastroenteritis, but couldn't say if it was caused by an infection, arsenic, or bad food. There was very little evidence that Florrie had administered the arsenic to James, especially as James was a known arsenic eater. When the house was searched, there was enough arsenic found to kill 50 people. The judge took 2 days to give his closing statement. It was a long and rambling condemnation of the moral character of Florrie, the adulteress. If she could do that, she clearly was a murderer, evidence be damned. It took the jury 45 minutes to return a guilty verdict. Florrie was sentenced to death. There was a public outcry on both sides of the Atlantic. Petitions were signed, meetings held, and articles written, all calling for Florrie's life to be spared. On the 22nd of August, just 4 days before her scheduled execution, Henry Matthews, the Home Secretary, and Lord Chancellor Halsbury concluded, quote, that the evidence clearly establishes that Mrs. Maybrick administered poison to her husband with intent to murder, but there is grounds for reasonable doubt whether the arsenic so administered was in fact the cause of death, essentially attempted murder. Her death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment for a crime she wasn't charged with or tried for. She was transported to Woking District Female Convict Prison until 1896, when she was moved to Aylesbury Prison. She spent the first 9 months in solitary confinement before being moved to another cell, but still under the constriction of the silence system, whereby silence was enforced at all times. In her memoir, she called the practice, quote, by far the most cruel feature of the English penal servitude. She then moved on to the probationary period and then on to hard labour, where she worked in the kitchen. After a re-examination of her case, Florrie was released in January 1904, after almost 15 years in prison. She had lost her US citizenship when she married a Brit, but it was returned to her and she went back to America. She took to the lecture circuit, campaigning for prison reform and protesting her innocence. She released her memoirs, Mrs. Maybrick's Own Story, My 15 Lost Years. In her later life, she moved to Connecticut and changed her name back to Chandler. She became a recluse, living in a 3-bedroom bungalow with her cats. A few residents knew her real identity, but they kept her secret. She died alone and penniless on the 23rd of October 1941. Her obituary was published on page 1 of the New York Times the next day. She was laid to rest next to a close friend, Clara Doolan, on the grounds of South Kent School. From the time of her conviction to the end of her life, Florrie would never see her children again. The children were taken in by Dr. Charles Chinner Fuller and his wife Gertrude. James would change his surname to Fuller. James became a mining engineer in British Columbia in 1911, aged 29, while working on the Leroy gold mine. He died after drinking cyanide solution. He believed it was a glass of water. Gladys went to live with Michael Maybrick and his wife Laura on the Isle of Wight, before marrying Frederick James Corbin in Hampstead, London in 1912. They had a long and happy marriage, and she passed away in 1971 in South Wales, where the couple had enjoyed their retirement. Michael Maybrick, James's brother, was a composer, writing under the name Stephen Adams. He is best known for the hymn The Holy City. This would be where the case would have concluded, had it not been for the discovery of a diary and pocket watch in 1992. The diarist is said to be James Maybrick, and in it he confesses to being Jack the Ripper. He had never been considered a suspect until this point. It was presented by Michael Barrett, who was given it by Tony Deroe down the pub. The exact story differs, but Michael's wife is supposed to have owned the diary. It had been in the family for many years. She asked Tony to give it to her husband in hopes he might write a book about it. It was published in 1993 as The Diary of Jack the Ripper. The author of the diary doesn't name himself in the writing, but refers to himself as Sir Jim, something James was known to call himself in America, along with other known facts about his life. In it, he claims responsibility for the 5 canonical victims and 2 others. Testing on the book concluded the binding and paper is of the correct vintage, but analysis of the ink is inconclusive. The motive for the Ripper murders is claimed to be Florrie's infidelity. The diary claims after he sees the bitch, or the whore, as he calls his wife, with her unnamed lover in Whitechapel district of Liverpool, it sent him on a murderous spree in London. Living in Liverpool does account for how the Ripper evaded the police after each kill as he disappeared back up north, and the sudden stop in the murders because James himself died. The descriptions of the crime does give a clearer picture, in my opinion, as to if the account is genuine. In it, there are inaccuracies and errors that were reported in the sensationalised reports of the newspapers of the time. One example is Mary Kelly's murder in 13 Miller Court and the details of the mutilations done to her body. In reality, the crime was confined to the bed and the immediate vicinity. Some reports gave the idea that parts were all over the room, one quote going as far as saying, hung around the walls like Christmas decorations. The diary states the breasts were placed on the bedside table when they were actually under the body. For me, this is the most telling. It makes me lean towards it being a hoax written from news sources rather than a private first-hand account. Let me know what your thoughts are. In January 1995, Michael Barrett swore in 2 separate affidavits that he was, quote, the author of the manuscript written by wife Anne Barrett at my dictation, which is known as the Jack the Ripper Diary. But then he repudiated, or withdrew, the affidavit, and then withdrew the repudiation. The second piece of evidence is a pocket watch. It was presented by Albert Johnson in June 1993. It was made by Verity of Rothwell in 1847 or 1848. It had J. Maybrick scratched on the inside cover, along with the words, I am Jack, and the initials of the 5 canonical victims. In 1993, it was examined by Dr. Stephen Togoose of the Corrosion and Protection Centre of the University of Manchester, using an electron microscope, and it was found to be compatible with the period 1888-1889. Robert Smith, the current owner of the diary, and publisher Shirley Harrison insist it is genuine, citing the accurate description of arsenic addiction that the author describes in the diary, the few details that the diary gets right that were not released to the public, and that one of the original crime scene photographs taken of Mary Kelly shows the initials FM written on the wall behind in blood, a reference to Florrie Maybrick. In his book, They All Love Jack, Bruce Robinson produces the argument that it was Michael Maybrick, not James, that was Jack the Ripper, although this theory is widely debunked. But one last twist before I ask what you think of this case. Among historians who believe the validity of the diary and that James Maybrick was Jack the Ripper, there is a theory that James was also a murderer in America, linking him to the 1884-1885 serial killer case, the Servant Girl Annihilator, who operated in Austin, Texas. So thank you for watching. Let me know what you think of this case in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.